Hey, real quick before we start the episode, I want to share something very special with you, something I'm super excited about. Very recently, I've started a group coaching mentorship program called Powerful Writers Magical Novels. In this group coaching mentorship, I help writers build their novels from the ground up. We figure out the big message of your novel, the character arc of your protagonist, the plot, the world building, and so much more. And then I teach all of the skills that a writer needs in order to write a great novel. And after that, we literally build the novel together over time. We do this in community. It gives writers the support and accountability that they need to actually make their novel a reality. What I really love about this program is that I am bottling what I do with my private clients and giving it to more writers at a much more affordable price. If this sounds like something that would be helpful to you on your writerly journey, please take a moment to sign up for a group coaching mentorship chat with me. It's 30 minutes, and we just talk about your story, your strengths, and the obstacles you face as a writer. I tell you a little more about the program, and then we figure out if the program is right for you. Okay, so super quick, go grab a chat and let's talk about it. Today is a very special day here on the podcast because we are having our first guest, my friend and colleague, Sam Cameron, who is a fantasy writer and a fellow book coach. In today's episode, Sam is going to be answering a very important question. How can writers craft characters from marginalized communities, such as the LGBTQ plus community, in a respectful and healthy way? Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world, too. Sam, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I'm so excited to have you here to talk about this really important topic that is so close to my heart and my family. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Great. I'm just going to dive into the questions because I'm going to pretend I'm a writer who is writing in this community, and I have a ton of questions for you because I am, and I do, and all of those good things. So my first question is, when I work with other writers and when I'm writing myself, I think fear around writing in the LGBT plus community, if you're not a part of it. What would you say to writers who are trying to add characters in who have these identities, but they're really worried about getting it wrong?
That's a really good question. And I actually write about this question all the time. I actually recently wrote a post that's going to be published on Jane Friedman. I don't know when this is going to come out, but the post will go up sometime in mid-March. And it's all about this issue of not only LGBTQ representation, but anytime you're writing about an identity that is a marginalized identity and is not one that you share. So the steps for getting it right in a nutshell are to do your research, to find beta or sensitivity readers who can give you feedback and let you know how you're doing, to generally just in your life cultivate an awareness of bias, both bias for the communities you're trying to represent, but also just general, like, what are the biases and tropes that exist in your world? Make your characters more than just their marginalized identity. That's oversimplifying, but you would want to make sure that you're doing all of those things. And then the other piece of this, if you're feeling very anxious, you want to include more queer characters or other kinds of marginalized characters. A very simple way to start is to include those identities for your non-POV characters. It's obviously a lot harder to have your POV character have a marginalized identity that you don't share because you're having to write in their head and their experience. So an easy starting point is to just diversify your background cast, to diversify your non-POV cast.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I definitely want to dive more into those 4 steps in just a moment. But I loved what you said about the idea of making it your non POV characters. And I was wondering, is there any worry then about diving into tokenism with
Mm-mm.
just making it like, oh, I need a gay character and I need, if we're talking about diversifying your cast, like I need a Black character, I need a whatever. What would you say to writers who are afraid of tokenism?
Yeah, I think that's a great point because you do run the danger of if that's what you intentionally try to do is, okay, I'm just going to diversify my secondary characters. You could very quickly run into that danger. One part of that is to, again, make sure that your characters serve a clear purpose for the story, that they're not just like a window dressing, that they're relevant to the plot. Let's say your protagonist is on their quest and they stop at the inn to rest for the night, and the innkeeper is a woman married to a woman. And that is if that is your only queer character, that might be feel like tokenism because that character isn't that important to the plot potentially. They're just a background character, and that might feel like you've just checked a box. You've briefly referenced that same-sex people can be married in this world, but otherwise you don't touch on it. That would feel like tokenism. Whereas if you have a character who's like really, truly, deeply relevant to the plot, who's a non POV character, who has a lot of other personality traits besides the fact that they're gay or trans, then that is less likely to be tokenism.
Well,
Also, if you
yeah.
have a character who's like very deeply relevant to the plot and has this very developed personality, chances are they're going to know other queer people and they aren't going to actually be the only queer person in your story.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So, the steps to make sure that we're not having tokenism when we're trying to diversify our cast is to make them relevant to the story. So, they're more than just a person who pops in for one moment just to tell us that they're gay and that gay is okay in this story or not okay, depending on the story.
Right.
And also to make them more than that characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah, so the a good test to run through is it's I actually was describing what's called the Vito Russo test, which is named after a film historian and one of the co-founders of both GLAAD and ACT UP. And he didn't invent the test. It was invented by some folks at GLAAD and they named it after him. And so the questions, it's like the Bechdel test, but
Mm-hmm.
for queer representation. So it's do you have at least one explicitly identify queer character? Like it is very obvious on the page that they're queer. That's one. Two is, are they identifiable by traits other than their queerness? Could you differentiate them from other characters by a trait other than the fact that they're queer? And three, do they matter to the plot such that their removal would dramatically alter the story?
I love that. I love that. I think that is such an important set of questions to run through in your head when you're introducing characters. And I loved what you said a minute ago about how they probably have other friends in the same community. And so they're not your only character. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like how writers would handle that if they're trying to introduce a secondary character and then that brings in more? And like, how would they balance that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, one of the tropes that I see sometimes, I feel like, especially in YA stories, I've heard someone describe this trope as the only queer kid in the world, where it's like you have a group of straight kids, cis straight kids, and they have one gay friend. And I'm not saying that this dynamic doesn't sometimes happen. Like, you do sometimes have a situation where you have a queer kid who doesn't really know a lot of other queer kids, or it so happens that the people they get along with the best are straight. But most LGBTQ people want to find other LGBTQ people, not only for like support and belonging, but also like romantic partnership, if that's a
Yeah.
thing that is interesting or appealing to you. And so for all of history, we've had ways of finding each other. So the idea that you have one queer character who is truly, completely, and totally alone and doesn't know any other queer characters seems unlikely. You could very much, again, have a situation where I recently read Teach the Torches to Burn, which is a Romeo and Juliet
Ooh.
retelling, where Romeo is gay and Juliet is ace, and it's a wonderful book. So there's a lot of queer characters in this, but at the beginning, Romeo thinks he's the only one because he's never met another queer person. But he very quickly, through the course of the book, finds out, that he's not alone, that there are lots of other queer people and there's lots of other types of queer identities besides the type that he has. So that would be a good example of someone who starts out thinking they're the only queer person in the world and then realizing they're not. But to go back to your original question about, you have a secondary character. If they're queer, they're probably not actually the only queer person in your world. So how do you go about introducing other queer characters without it becoming tokenism or becoming, you just have this pile of characters who aren't
relevant in some way to the
you're
story.
relevant. Yeah. One way of doing that is to think about the rest of your cast of characters, and if there's any other characters in the cast that this character already relates to in some way or has some tie to, who it would make sense that this character could also be queer. Or even just having this person at some point reference other queer people they know might be a way to do that without having to put another character on the page.
All right. I love that. I love that. I think that's really great advice. So, what would you say, and what are your thoughts on the idea? So, I know that there are many writers who would love to write their protagonist as a queer character, but they themselves don't identify that way. And they're really worried because they've heard a lot in the news and in discussions about how it's not appropriate for people outside of the community. So, you should write what you know. What are your thoughts on that? And what would you tell them?
That's a good question. So, one thing to be aware of if you want to wade into this space, no matter what you do, people are going to want to know if you are queer, if you're writing in this space, which is really unfortunate. I think that we should get past asking these questions because, in the particular case of gender and sexual orientation, for some writers who might be questioning or closeted, writing in this space is a safe way for them to explore that part of their identity. So very famously, this happened to Becky Albertalli, who wrote Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda and a number of other books featuring queer protagonists. And she was straight passing. So she was ostensibly straight. And there was, when her book became famous because a movie was made of it, the movie's called Love, Simon. So when it was made into a movie, this drew a lot of attention to her and her book. And so there was suddenly a lot of fans as well as critics who were basically like, oh, you're a straight woman. Why are you writing about gay boys? What do you have to write about this? And then the more she was writing about queer teenagers, the more people were asking these questions. So it pushed her into a space of trying to question for herself why she was doing it. And she came to the realization that she's bi. And that's a deeply personal thing to figure out. And she ended up having to figure this out in public online, like in a kind of traumatic way. And nobody should have to do that. I personally think that as an audience, we shouldn't necessarily be worrying so deeply about the gender identity and sexual orientation as credentials for our writers, because I think that this is a really tricky space where, on the one hand, you want people to be able to represent themselves, but you never know from just like looking at somebody if they are queer or not. And nobody should have to share that information if they don't want to. And I do think that there's some writers that write in this space because they're closeted or questioning. So in my own experience, I used to not write about queer characters because I wasn't ready to be out in public. And I knew that if I wrote about queer characters, I would be pushed into a position of having to be out, right? Or at the very least, that would be questioned. So if you are going to write in that space and you're not in the LGBTQ community, or you are LGBTQ plus and you're not out, you should be prepared that if your work's going to be in public, your sexual orientation and gender identity are going to be questioned by strangers. And so if that is not something you feel comfortable wading into, it might be better if that is a private writing that you do. So I hate to have to say that, but I think that's a reality.
No, I think it's so important to talk about these things, and the idea of what you said about it being a credential. And I agree that right now in the writing world, that is true. And I also agree with what you said about that we shouldn't be asking those questions of people. A lot of times when someone become famous and then we feel like we have the right to ask them a lot of personal questions that actually don't concern their art at all. As long as the representation is respectful and accurate, the work should stand for itself. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So my personal feeling is that you could be straight and cisgendered and you could write an incredibly well-researched, thought-out, represented queer person in your work. And that's great. I love that. I think
Mhm.
that's wonderful. And I think you should go for it. Just be aware that not everyone's going to feel that way. And so, no matter how good of a job you do, there are always going to be some people who will be upset about the fact that you did it. There's no way you can do it perfectly. And there are going to be people who are going to ask you very personal questions about your sexual orientation and your gender identity.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for writers to think about when they start writing in this space. I don't think it's so much a problem if it's a secondary character, but for sure, if you write protagonists from these identities, you will be asked. And I think it's important for writers to really think about that so that they don't have that traumatic experience of trying to figure it all out in public, like you were saying right now, because that's terrible. So I do want to ask you in a couple minutes about the steps. I think those are so important, but I want really quickly because we've asked about what about the people who aren't in the LGBT community? But what about those writers who are a part of the community and they're getting ready to dive in and write about a character that might not share their exact identity, but it's still within the umbrella community? What would you say to those writers about tackling these identities?
So, I think that you still need to go through all the same steps that a straight and cisgender writer goes through. You are going to have a little more closeness to the subject matter. You'll know a little bit more of what it's like. But it's important to keep in mind that just within the umbrella of LGBT, there's like a whole wide range of stereotypes and experiences that are unique to each flavor in the
Mhm.
rainbow.
Yeah.
And also there are varying levels of privilege. So, for example, cis gay men may have more privilege than cis gay women in a different
Mhm.
way. The experience of a bisexual person of any gender is going to be different than the experience of a gay person, right? Someone who's only attracted to people of the same gender. There's different stereotypes for bisexual people, there's different stereotypes and tropes for asexual people. There's different level of privilege if you're cisgender and queer versus if you're transgender. If you're writing about, even honestly, if you're writing about your own identity, no group is a monolith. Your experience of being bi might be totally different than another person's experience of being bi. So even if you are part of this community, you still are going to want to do some research, cultivate your awareness of what are the tropes. And also, I would add in that just being a part of the community doesn't like endow you with a special spidey sense for the tropes. Like you can actually be more vulnerable to internalizing negative tropes if you're a part of that community and not realize that you're relying on them. The same steps, I think, still apply. You would still want to make sure you're doing the research and understanding the tropes, getting opinions from other queer writers and queer readers of various different backgrounds and identities, and also still be aware that there's going to be some people who like your book and there's going to be some people who don't. And that's the same of any people will like your plot, some people won't. So you're going to do the best you can and accept that you're never going to write a book that everybody's going to universally love.
And I think that makes so much sense because even when we're a part of a community, sometimes we have internalized certain biases or certain tropes or whatever they are that really influence the way we write and present that type of character to the world. I know I've seen it over and over again, not just with people who are writing in the LGBTQ community, but also, for instance, women writers sometimes perpetuating stereotypes of what it means to be a woman. So to really take a closer look, no matter who you're writing about, and say, what are the realities here and how is my experience maybe different
Mhm.
from someone else within the same community that I'm a part of? So I think that's so important for
Yeah.
writers to think about.
And something I know, like, I've had to unpack a lot is as a woman who's attracted to other women, most of my experiences of seeing what attraction to women looks like is through a very male gaze. So it's like this weird thing of, on the one hand, as a woman experiencing that gaze, knowing that it's negative,
Mhm.
but then having those same feelings projected onto other women from my own perspective, because that's how I learned that what
Mhm.
attraction to women looks like. So there's a lot of unpacking, even if it's your own identity.
I love that the way you say there's a lot of unpacking because I think with writing, that's exactly what it is. When we start really diving into our characters and our stories, we start having to unpack our own psychology and what things mean to us and really take a hard look at the way we're thinking about things and to get around writing very superficial characters and very superficial representations of them. We have to really think about who we are and why we think the way we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us about the steps. What are the steps? So we've decided we're going to write a character in this community and we want to get it as right as possible and do as little harm as possible and hopefully allow our readers to take a walk in someone else's shoes for a little while. So what do we do?
All right. So step one is to do your research and really as deep research as you can from what I call inside eyes. So doing research of what the feelings and the history of this community and identity are from the perspective of people who are in that community. So an example that I think illustrates this really well and why this is important would be, let's say you want to write about a transgender character or transgender experiences. And you're like, oh, the New York Times has lots of articles about gender affirming care and transgender people. Oh, look, here's an op-ed written by a transgender person. Here's an interview in which they quote a transgender person. So I'm going to look at all of these New York Times articles. And that will give you a perspective, but it is an outsider's perspective. And if you go look at the coverage of the New York Times from an insider perspective, what you find is that actually a lot of trans folks are really upset about the way that the New York Times covers transgender people and gender affirming care, because the New York Times asks a lot of questions that trans folks find very harmful or that they find very delegitimizing of their identities. The counterpoint I would bring up is GLAAD, so that's GLAAD, which is a media advocacy organization. So this is a really great resource for writers because GLAAD's mission is to promote better representation of LGBTQ people across all media, both fiction and nonfiction. So they actually have an open letter to the New York Times in which they're like, New York Times, here's what's wrong with your coverage of transgender people and what we would like you to change. So if you only were looking at the outside eyes, the New York Times is still a very reputable source. It's generally a good newspaper, but they have this giant blind spot regarding how transgender people would like to be talked about and represented. It's important when you're doing the research to not just look at what have people outside this community said about it, but what do people who identify this way have to say, et cetera, et cetera. A couple of caveats with that. One is you should start with sources that already exist rather than immediately going to the people you know. Right. I have done this, and I have, again, a huge thank you to all of my friends who have humored me asking them questions like this before I knew any better. What I didn't realize is that it's a huge amount of emotional labor potentially to ask somebody to talk to you about how they feel about the way that their identity is represented. And some of your friends might be happy to have that conversation, but there's also plenty of people who make it a part of their paid work to write about these things and talk about these things. So try to find those sources first rather than immediately turning to the people you know. And then the second caveat is check the dates on your sources, because if we look at like transgender issues in particular, our understanding and our way of thinking and our cultural place where we are has changed really dramatically in a very short period of time. So memoirs that were written a decade ago may be a little outdated in terms of how most trans people would talk about their experience. So it's not that it's like a bad source to use, but you would also want to make sure the sources you're consulting are relatively up to date.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there are so many things that are constantly evolving in the way the community talks about itself. Okay, so step 2, what do we do after we do the research and get the inside track on what's going on?
Yeah, so I think the next piece is throughout your writing process, it would be a good idea to have some beta and sensitivity readers. So a sensitivity reader, for those, I think most of you will probably have been familiar with this term, but a sensitivity reader is a beta reader who specifically is looking at your work for your representation of a particular identity. A lot of times a sensitivity reader is someone who will have that identity, but it does not necessarily need to be. So it could just be someone who has an understanding of how that identity, like what are the problematic tropes, things like that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be someone from in the community, but it should be someone who is credentialed or has some reason why they would know that. I am a cisgender person, but I feel like I could be a pretty good sensitivity reader for transgender representation because that's a community I know relatively well. I have an understanding of the tropes. But even if I was writing a transgender character, for example, I would still get a sensitivity reader for my own work to look at it. In terms of where to find sensitivity readers, because that's probably the big question.
Yeah, I think a
Um,
lot of writers struggle with that. They're like, okay, I know I need one, but where in the world do I look for one? And how do I know if they're qualified to, give me the type of feedback I need?
yeah, so it's really tricky. I would say the fastest route to a sensitivity reader is to actually hire a beta reader through an organization like the Spun Yarn. And the Spun Yarn is a really good source to go to because it's basically a service where they've hired a bunch of contract workers to be beta readers. And I'm not a beta reader for the Spun Yarn, but I did look through their application process because I was curious. So when you apply to be a beta reader for the Spun Yarn, they ask you questions about what are your particular areas of expertise? Are there any identities that you are part of a community or have an identity where you would be interested or able to be a sensitivity reader? So on the reader side, they have an application process so that they know who are their readers who are well suited to be sensitivity readers. And then when you as the writer engage the services of Spun Yarn, you can tell them, I would really like a transgender sensitivity reader or a sensitivity reader for transgender representation in my book. And they can match you with somebody who is a good fit for that. So that's one way. Another way is to actually work with a book coach like Heather or myself, who specifically states on our website that this is an issue we know about and care about. Obviously, a book coach will do more for you than just a sensitivity reader would. It's a more in-depth process, but you would potentially get some sensitivity reading type feedback in that relationship. And a book coach can also help you with the research and development portion. So if you're very early on in the stages of this, and you're feeling overwhelmed about the idea of the research too, a book coach might be a good idea. Other places to look for sensitivity readers are, you could ask if you have queer acquaintances or friends or family members. If you think they might be a good person to read your work, you could ask them if they'd be willing to do that. If you don't think they'd be a good fit or they don't want to do it, as I mentioned before, queer people generally know other queer people. And so they might know somebody who would be a good fit, or they might have a community that they're a part of, or like an organization that they're a part of, where they can post on a message board, my niece has written a book and is looking for a sensitivity reader, yada, yada, yada. So that would be another potential avenue.
Okay, I love that. And how many sensitivity readers would you suggest that a writer go out and get? Is just one
Oh,
enough?
that's a great question. Yeah, so I would say one is not enough. And the reason is that no community is a monolith. So just because one person says, yep, this is great, doesn't mean that you've avoided all of the problems.
Yeah.
And the other reason is that there might also be some things that that particular person is not upset by, but a lot of other people find very offensive. So I would say 3 is like a good sort of magic number. You don't want to like have so many sensitivity readers that you have an overwhelming amount of feedback. If you have 3, you have a tiebreaker potentially. So let's say if you only had 2 and they're in disagreement, the third one is the ability to have a tiebreaker of, okay, random sampling seems to be relatively okay. The other place where you may want to consider is that, so with a regular beta reader, you would engage their services when your manuscript is done to a certain extent. You have a complete book to show them. If you're working with a sensitivity reader, you might actually want to start getting feedback at an earlier stage. Because, for example, you might inadvertently have your entire plot revolve around a very hurtful trope, and it would be better to know that earlier. So one of the tropes that I really hate is the closeted bully trope. So you have a queer character who's being bullied by another character. It turns out that bully character is closeted. They figure out that they're queer. And then in a lot of cases, start up a relationship with the person they'd been bullying. And what I hate about that is frequently when that trope's engaged, those are the only 2 queer characters, or there's not very many other queer characters. And it's also like an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
And is not, I think, appropriately called out. I also think that it is used as a way to excuse straight and cisgender people from homophobia and transphobia. It just ignores all of the systems that discriminate against queer people. So let's say you didn't know any of that, and now you do. So now you can take that out of your book. But let's say you had a plot that revolved significantly around the trope of the closeted bully. It would be better if you knew, if you had someone point that out to you in your outlining or early drafting stage, rather than now my manuscript is basically done. What do I do? If you're representing a community, a marginalized community that is not one that you're part of, you may actually want to get beta readers or sensitivity readers involved in the much earlier than you normally would. And depending on the kind of feedback you get, so let's say your first pass, you get a lot of sensitivity readers flagging a lot of things. You have a lot of changes to do. You may want to come back after you've done those revisions and find more sensitivity readers. So 3 is like, I would say, a good average number, but you may need more than that depending on how many passes you're going through.
No, that makes a lot of sense. The idea, and I think that might be applicable, honestly, not just for people outside of the community, but also for writers within the community, because like you were saying earlier, so many times we've internalized certain tropes and we might not even realize that we're perpetuating that trope until it's brought to our attention. And I love what you said about getting someone to look at it early because we just don't want to do any harm. We also don't want to spend a year or 2 or 3 years writing a book and then have someone say, at page 1, rewrite, when it's something that could have been cleared up pretty easily in the outlining
Yeah.
stage. So I love that. I love that so much. Okay, so we've researched, we've got our sensitivity readers. Now what do we do?
So the third step is, I think it is just generally a good idea to cultivate a broad awareness of tropes and bias, even for communities you are not intentionally trying to represent. Because you may, like, part of what makes tropes and stereotypes really insidious is that they're invisible to us. As soon as they're visible, they lose their power over us. And it is only when they're invisible and unstated that they act as shortcuts. So some tropes are good. I just wanted to clarify that. So, for example, a lot of people love a fake dating trope. So that is a trope that what you love about it is we have certain expectations of what's going to happen in a plot that relies on a fake dating trope. So tropes like play on our subconscious and allow writers to take a little bit of a shortcut. So that can be a good thing when it serves a purpose of your reader knows what structure to expect of your book, and that's why they want to read it. But when tropes are used for like representation, the problem is that they can actually be totally invisible to you until you have an awareness that those are tropes. So I'll give a personal example of this. So I was listening to a friend of mine in 2019 recommended a podcast called Witch Please, which is a Harry Potter podcast. And the women who recorded it are literature professors from Canada. And although they're fans of the book, they're very critical of a lot of J.K. Rowling's opinions and also her representations in the book. And that's what they go through the books with, the critical lens. And so when I was first listening to this podcast, I had very little awareness, like conscious awareness of anti-fat bias, right? It was all something that was a part of my subconscious. Like I had internalized the tropes. I was not consciously aware of them. And I was listening to these two professors talk about the way that J.K. Rowling uses fatness in her books as a shortcut for moral degeneracy or cruelty. And she's able to do that because these tropes have long existed in the Western canon of literature. And I realized as I was listening to this podcast, not for the purpose of educating myself about tropes, that I had a character in the book I was working on where I had basically done the same thing. As a shortcut for, oh, this is a bad guy, I had made him fat. And I was like, oh, not only is this harmful, it's also, I've been a sloppy writer. I just haven't done the work to develop this character. So I went back and revised that character. I was like, okay, so what would happen if I made him conventionally attractive instead and muscular and thin? Now I had to do a lot more work to make it clear that this was a sinister character instead of relying on a stereotype. And it actually made him a better character, in addition to removing that harmful trope from my book. So you might do all this work to consciously be aware of, okay, I'm trying to represent this group. Here's how I'm going to make sure I avoid the tropes. And you could be totally not aware of something else that you are or are not doing with a group that you're not thinking about.
Yeah, I love that. That is absolutely true because we have these blind spots. We all do. We have grown up listening to and reading and watching stories, and we aren't even aware probably of 80% of the scripts that are already in our heads.
Yeah.
And I think what I heard you say before is tropes are okay if you can insert any identity into them. Like the fake dating, I could insert any identity into that. So it's
Yes.
not targeting identities. It's not taking a shortcut to tell us what the inside of a person is by seeing what their outside is. So
Yeah, I
we
think if you're using tropes for a plot purpose rather than a characterization purpose, plot tropes I think are great. People love certain plot tropes. It's the characterization tropes that you have to be much more careful about.
one of the things that I do with my own work, because I write about marginalized characters in my work, and I also have the writers I work with do, is when I'm going to write a character with a certain identity, I go out there and I Google tropes about that person. And I write them all down on the left side of my paper. And I say, okay, my character is going to be anti each of these tropes. How can I develop them such that they don't fit into these stereotypes or these ways that we just automatically think that person should behave because that's what we've seen represented before. Are there any tips or tricks that you give the writers you work with or that you do yourself when you're trying to make sure that you don't fall into those traps?
Yeah, so I think that's a good strategy that you were talking about. I do want to add that if there is a trope that it or a stereotype that it actually makes sense for your character to embody, that as long as they are not straight down the line all of the stereotypes, that's okay. And I've also seen it used very effectively when the narrator or the character has a clear awareness of how they are being a stereotype. So one I've seen very commonly, there's a stereotype about queer women that queer women are quick to commit. It's called U-hauling, right? The idea that on the second date, a lesbian or a bisexual woman brings a U-haul because they're going to move in with their woman partner.
Right.
And there are some queer women who do commit very quickly and will like joke about the fact that they're doing that. And so the clear distinction here is I've seen books where the characters will actually narrate on, oh, I'm going full U-haul with this woman,
Right.
or will deny that they're doing it. No, I'm not U-hauling. So actually calling out the tropes in the narrative and having the characters be aware of the stereotype is one way to deal with that, especially if for the purposes of your plot or character, it might actually make sense for them to embody a stereotype as long as they are not embodying all of the stereotype, and as long as I think you can have a meta narration about and have them have the discomfort on the page about it.
Okay, I really love that. So it's about not necessarily avoiding all of the stereotypes because stereotypes sometimes they do in some way reflect reality. It's about being very cognizant of what we're putting on the page, that they don't match all their stereotypes. And then I guess going back to the sensitivity reader, that the one that we've chosen isn't one that's offensive, right? So they have to work hand in hand there.
Yeah, so it's not a rather than it being a stereotype that is a hurtful stereotype, it's one that people within the community can get a laugh out of when they recognize it in themselves.
Perfect. No, I think that's really helpful for writers to think about because I think we also run the risk of if we are avoiding all the stereotypes, then maybe we're not really reflecting the character that we're trying to reflect. So it is maybe helpful to sit there and think about, okay, what are the stereotypes that, again, are not harmful and that allow readers with a certain identity to see themselves or their friends or people they know
Hmm.
reflected. I know my sister sometimes, she'll read a certain writer who I love and I will not name. And she'll say, oh, I just loved reading his female character. It was so funny because you could tell that a man wrote it. So the idea of you don't always see, if they're trying to avoid a lot of stereotypes, you don't always see reality reflected at all.
Which I think also touches again on the fact that you want to just make sure all of your characters are well developed, that
Yeah.
they have more than one character trait.
Mm.
So I think your strategy for the list of stereotypes and tropes is a useful one because, so let's say, there's the trope or the stereotypical like gay male character who's like very camp, likes clothes and fashion, very cosmopolitan,
Mhm.
urbane, sassy, like all of those tropes. And if your character is all of the stereotypes and there's not a clear plot specific reason for them to be all of the stereotypes, even if there is plot, like I can't really think of many plot specific reasons you would want a character who is all of the stereotypes. I think also if you're going to have a very stereotypical character for any reason, or you're using any of the stereotypes, having a variety of characters is a good way to counterbalance and say, okay, so this character may embody this stereotype and everyone, in their community is having a laugh at their expense, but they have this friend who is absolutely not that stereotype and has all of these other things to counterbalance them, is another way to approach that.
I love that so much. So, are there stereotypes or tropes, if you could just call out 3 that you would love to never see again?
So the closeted bully, which I talked about already, and it's not that queer people don't have toxic relationships or abusive relationships. And I think there absolutely does need to be space to talk about it, but we just don't need the closeted bully, especially not in YA. That just does so much harm. The second one is the social groomer, queer person. Not saying that you can't have queer villains, but there is so much like within the anti-queer rhetoric right now that is accusing queer people of being pedophiles, of being social groomers, that really just don't write about it. Like, we don't need a fictionalized version of that to do more harm to queer people. And then the bisexual erasure, like the idea that of like identifying a bisexual person's sexual orientation based on the gender of their current partner, rather than being like, oh, you can be attracted to people of multiple genders. That one, I think, is the other one. I'm bi, so that one, I think, particularly bothers me on a personal level, because in the times of my life where I've been in a relationship that presented as straight, my queer identity has been invisible. In the times of my life when I've been with a woman, people, also because of my haircut, those of you on the podcast can't see, but I've got like the stereotypical queer woman haircut with the undercut. People assume I'm a lesbian, and I'm not. I'm bi. So that seeing it reflected in media where there's this inability to hold 2 things at once, that you can be in a same-sex relationship and be bi, and there's a lot of people like that, or you can be in a different sex relationship and still be bi.
Right.
So that one bothers me a lot.
Yeah, so allowing more room for the messiness of reality in your novels, I think. So not trying to just make it easy for yourself when you're writing, like allowing the identity of being bi, for instance, to come through. I think that's one that I'm starting to see show up a little bit more in books, but I still think we have a long way to go. So those 3 tropes, if you're out there listening to this, never write those again. And you should go look up all the other tropes and stereotypes that you should avoid, because there are a lot of them. There are so many. Oh my gosh. Okay. If you could think, so for me as a writer, when I decide to write about a topic, whether it's about a character with a certain identity or some other thing, what I do is I go out there and I try and read the best books that have been written that have done that, right? So that, because I learn by watching someone else how they did it. And I'm like, oh, that's how they talked about this identity in a non-hurtful way, or whatever it is. So if you could just handpick 2 or 3 books that you thought really did a great job with representation of the LGBTQ plus community, what would those books be?
So I have so many to recommend. I've narrowed it down to 4. And they're all speculative, because I know that your listeners write speculative fiction, and these 4 represent, all of them I think do queer identities very well, and they represent a wide variety of the genre of speculative fiction, and also a wide variety of how you can approach representing LGBTQ people in speculative fiction. So I'll read out all of them first, and then I'll explain a little bit about how each one represents a different piece of this. So they are This Poison Heart by Kaylin Bayron. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her name, so apologies. The Sunbearer Trials by Aidan Thomas, In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens, and A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsky. This Poison Heart is young adult fantasy, and it's the type of fantasy where it's in our world, but there's magic. And I think that there's a little bit of portal fantasy in the second book, which I haven't read yet. And the main character is bisexual. She has 2 moms. And I believe, if I'm remembering right, that her moms are both lesbians. And they're black and queer. And in this book, even though it takes place in our world, the marginalization of those identities don't play a particularly big role in the story. It's just, this is who we are. It's very believable. Like, you can envision this family in a very delightful way. Like, the relationship between the 2 moms is fantastic. And the main character's relationship to her moms, and has a different relationship with each of the moms. They have different personalities. is just fabulous. The representation of those characters is really great. It's a representation not only of a queer protagonist, but her queer family, which I think is really important. It's a good example of intersectional identity. And it's a type of fantasy where, again, they have queer identities, but the queer identities are not the point of the book, right? And the
I love
marginalization of
that.
their queer identity is not the point of the book. It's a good example of you can write a book in which the discrimination is not a major focus.
I love
Um,
that because so often the books that we find, and there should be lots of books out there like this, but so often it's hard to find books where the identity is just innately in there and it's not about them overcoming some obstacle about being discriminated against. So I love that you have that in there. That's wonderful.
yeah. So that's This Poison Heart. The second book was The Sunbearer Trials by Aidan Thomas. So this is a second world fantasy, high fantasy. It takes place in a sort of contemporary-ish world, but it's inspired by the theology of the Aztec Empire in like central Mexico. And the main character is a transgender boy who is a demigod, and he is the son of the god Quetzal. And so he is part bird. And the world that this character lives in is very inclusive of transgender folks. So it is not a problem that he is transgender, but he still deals with body dysphoria. And one of the things I find very interesting about the way that Aidan Thomas approached this is that the main character, as I said, is part bird. He has bird wings. And if you know anything about birds, the plumage of birds is very different depending on male and female
Mm-hmm.
birds. And so one of the ways this character deals with body is that he lives in a world where he's able to have surgery for his human part of his body
Mm-hmm.
to align with his gender identity, but not the bird part of his body.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has a lot of dysphoria about these wings that he has, which have female plumage. Again, a really great example of it's a non-Western fantasy that's done in a really interesting way. There's a lot of queer characters besides the main character. And even though this is a world where this identity is not a problem, it's just accepted, this character still has real things that he has to deal with about his identity that makes sense for the world that this writer created. So that's another really good example. In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens is an example of another example of a second world fantasy. Queer identities are not problematized. It is a non-patriarchal world. The main character is bisexual. He falls in love with a merman. It's just a very sweet book. And so it's a really good example, again, of representation in a way where the identities are not problematized. So most of these examples I gave are in places where there's not any sort of exploration of the problems and the discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
So the last example I picked does deal a little bit more with when you have queer characters who are living in a world where their identity is discriminated against. So that's A Marvelous Light. So this takes place in the 20th century, early 20th century, real world, but there's magic that most people don't know about that's happening in the background. And so the queer characters in this book live in a world where their identity is illegal, but it still approaches the ways in which even when queer people have lived and do continue to live in places where their identities are illegal, they still find each other and find happiness and joy.
Nice. No, I think it's very important. I'm glad that you also are talking about one where, because I think writers are on either side of that. Some writers of fantasy want to imagine a world where everything is just finally what it should be, and that the focus isn't their identity and their identity can simply exist within the story. But then there are some other stories, and I'm thinking dystopian and things like that, where really the exploration of the identity still being persecuted is an important part of it. So it's really nice that writers can have
Yeah.
a lot of different books that they can go study, because I really do believe that we can learn how to do things really well by watching the masters having done it. So,
Yeah. And I personally write both because I think there is something nice about getting to imagine that world where those identities aren't problematized. But it's also really hard to create
yeah.
a world where that's true because you have to do so much of your own exploring and unlearning. I was writing a book where I had a bisexual female protagonist. I was like wanting to make it a world where that wasn't a problem, but the plot is predicated on it being a very patriarchal society. And it didn't logically make any sense to have it be a really patriarchal society that would have been okay with her queer identities. Some of it is like you have to logic through it. And then there's also like the piece of sometimes you may want to explore that. So like I've written pieces where I am exploring the more problematic parts of the identity. And I've had critique partners be like, oh, but do you have to do that? Yes, I do, because I need that. For me, like I need to explore that.
I think that's such an important piece of this. I know when I'm writing, I'm doing something similar. Mine is a dystopian novel that I'm writing. And to think about this society and ignore that they would persecute these identities, it wouldn't make sense. And also, there's a part of working through and using things as metaphor and trying to, it's so hard sometimes to imagine the real world getting better. I know that sounds terrible, but when you can create your own world and then say, okay, here are its problems, but I can see a way through in this world that I've created. So making things better through exploring the deep problems that mirror our world but aren't exactly our world, I think is a draw in speculative fiction
Yeah.
for so many of us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, Sam, thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us about this really important topic. You are my first guest on the podcast, and I could not imagine a better first guest considering that this is my biggest passion around writing is representation of marginalized communities. So thank you for coming on here. And I think you have a special little gift for my listeners. Can you tell us about that?
I do. So like Heather, this is something I care deeply about. Written a lot and recorded a lot about this. So I made a quiz, a free quiz that is called Is My Manuscript LGBTQ plus inclusive? And you can find it on my website, truantpen.com/LGBTQ. And taking the quiz will walk you through testing for the Vito Russo test, testing for the biggest, most problematic tropes that you might include. And when you finish the quiz, you'll get added to my email list and you will get regular emails in which you get to hear my perspective and some more advice and tips about addressing this.
Awesome. And could you tell us really quickly? So I know that you coach YA. What else do you coach? Can you just give us a rundown? So if there are listeners out there who are like, oh, after hearing you talk today, like that is exactly the person I think I need to talk to. Tell us what else your specialties are.
So YA speculative is definitely my sweet spot. I also coach adults, and romance, I would say, is a big one for me, and especially rom-com and speculative of all stripes. And I'm also a pretty good fit for middle grade. So middle grade through adult, speculative of any kind. I especially would love to help you get your LGBTQ representation out into the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And hopefully we can talk again in the future. Okay, writers, I hope that was helpful. I know I sure learned a lot from my conversation with Sam, and I hope you did too. Please don't forget to go take Sam's quiz. It is really awesome. It will definitely help you to make sure that your manuscript is more LGBTQ plus inclusive. You can find the link to that quiz right in the show notes, or you can go to truantpen.com/LGBTQ. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now, so don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself.